now I'm going to give up the floor for Fiona Knox.
Thank you very much, Tiago. That was just a beautiful way to start the afternoon session. As everyone knows, we're deeply honored to have our keynote speaker, Jennifer Harbury, here, and it's appropriate that she be introduced by a woman, and it's appropriate she be introduced by a woman who has been at the heart of the social justice movement for decades and decades, a real worker in encuentros for years and years and years, and in the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. A great pleasure to introduce the person who's going to introduce the person. Please welcome Fiona Knox.
I just want to tell you how proud I am of you here at the 20th Encuentro, because 20 years ago, inspired by Chris Okerhauser, who is somewhere here in the heart of the sanctuary movement, we met, a lot of us sitting on the floor of the living room of a member of this Santa Monica Unitarian Church. We met as a district-wide group, and people came from many churches at the home of Ginny Moore. And to see what you've come up with the last few years and crowned by this year is wonderful. Okay, I'm really proud of you. And I'm proud to have the privilege of introducing my dear friend, Jennifer Harbury. Her topic is U.S. involvement in torture, legal, historical, and security issues. Many of you do not need any introduction to Jennifer because you were the ones who did the lobbying, the phone calls, the letter writing, the visits, the demonstrations. You helped organize the big events, one in this church, one at the Jewish Temple up on Sepulveda, where Jennifer spoke. And so I say thank you so much for what you did roughly 10 years ago for a couple of years. You were always responsive. You forwarded phone calls. You made the lobbying happen. So thank you. So who is Jennifer, for those of you who don't know her? Who is Everardo, who you'll hear a teeny bit about? And why is she talking on torture 10 years later? For me, it was an accidental phone call to Jim Schreider, a Episcopal priest. I just said, what have you been doing recently? And he said, well, I've just come from being with a young woman, Jennifer Harbury, as she sat for 7 days in front of the military installation in Guatemala City. She sat fasting. And so my association began, and it was wonderful. He told me she's been searching for her husband, Everardo, Comandante Everardo, of one of the revolutionary groups fighting against the military government of Guatemala, which, as you heard this morning from one of our speakers, was installed with the help of the CIA, the U.S. It was a U.S.-sponsored coup in 1954, which installed the military government. And he said, I've been reading this book, Bridge of Courage, which came out in the early 90s, about 1994, I suspect. And so that brings up how and why Jennifer got involved. This contains her interviews with, let's say, 20 individuals that she met when she went to Guatemala in 1984, 86, went for a week and stayed a year, and then for the next few years was interviewing people. And the most exciting thing, I think, is that she was so well trained planning that she hiked into the volcano in the mountains where the revolutionaries were living. And she spent a month there, and that's where she met Comandante Everardo. So I'll just skim through really roughly what's probably in your packet, although if you're like me, you go home and kind of don't bother looking it over. She's a graduate of Harvard Law School. During that time, she worked in the Rio Grande Valley and in the panhandle of Texas, some of the time with the TRLA, Texas Rural Legal Assistance, a government-financed group, and she kept seeing refugees coming across the border who had scars of one sort or another, psychological and physical. And so in '84, she decided to go down and get more evidence so that she could support her IRS petitions for refugee status. And as I said, she returned and she went to the mountains and met Everardo. They were married in roughly 1990. On March 12, 1992, he was reported killed. Later on, he was reported seen alive. And thus began Jennifer's story, going into a 32-day hunger strike in front of the National Palace in Guatemala City. Some of you saw this in 60 Minutes with Mike Wallace interviewing her, in which, how did she survive those 30 days plus 12 more days a few months later in front of the White House. And one of the things I love is when she says, well, I was built like a Mack truck. And the other day she said, I'm a bionic woman. She survived on water and, and electrolytes for all those total of, the last two strikes kind of go together, 44 days. But at the end of that, she was told by Representative Torricelli, called away from Lafayette Park into the office of Representative Torricelli, and was told that Everardo not only was dead, but our CIA, our State Department, had known it for 2 years, known that he was alive and in prison and then had been killed. And so began her efforts to locate her, or the efforts had begun earlier, of course, and that's where we all got involved. So what has she been doing since the hunger strike? She has sued the CIA, the NSA, the Guatemalan government. That was in front of the OAS, and the suit was won. And so she has continued to travel back and forth to Guatemala for the last 8-10 years because of these suits, gathering evidence, finding. Rather than going on, I suggest that you go to, people want to know, we had these, we've run out, they're no longer, we don't have any more today. This book is called Searching for Everardo, has a picture on the cover of Jennifer holding a picture of her husband taken down at the National Palace. You can go to Amazon.com and purchase them. Sometimes they won't have it, but try again. They do have them later on. In addition to these endless trips, we now know that the CIA was involved in the torture and death of her husband through paid assets, etc. Right now, she's finishing a book due to the printers by the 1st of December, and it's documenting 20 cases of torture, so watch for that. The title hasn't been chosen yet, so I can't tell you what to look for. I just learned last night that the 9/11 Commission report has been read, and we're not sure whether it was Rumsfeld or Cheney, but we are sure it was Father Bush who has blamed 9/11 on Jennifer. Now that's shorthand. But it is a fact that over and over again in certain news stories, Jennifer was named as, because of her suits, we couldn't get the intelligence we needed. So that is a fact and something. And just to tempt you, yesterday morning, because I know she wants to mention it and it doesn't quite fit in, I guess, there was a phone call after she read something on my computer. She was talking to Mordecai Vanunu, the man who's just been released, and she is one of the volunteers working with him. So, welcome, Jennifer.
Well, I'm very, very glad to be back with the UUSCs in Los Angeles, and just want to start, of course, by thanking every single one of you for all of the letters and all of the support and all of the phone calls and all of the cards and everything over the years. I think I'm still standing here because of people like you, and I really, really appreciate everything that was done for me. I know often that kind of work can seem really boring or tedious or endless, but it saves people's lives. It really does. So thank you again. Feels kind of like more than anything a family reunion for me today. My favorite aunt, Jane Brooks, is here, and my soul sister, Fiona Knox, is here, and my international family with Alicia and Mario and Maria and Eduardo back here are all here. So I'm feeling very supported and very happy. I can see it's going to be a very hostile audience today, but but I think given that we just have gotten George Bush somehow back into the White House for another 4 years, we can take today as our first meeting on putting our boots back on and figuring out what to do next. And I think given what happened at Abu Ghraib and Iraq and Afghanistan with all of the detainees and down in Guantanamo, maybe torture is the very, very first issue we need to address, because if we take that linchpin out of our legal and social fabric, I'm not sure what's left. And that's a very, very great concern to me. I was very pleased when I saw the reaction of almost everybody in the United States to those photographs from the Iraqi prison, Abu Ghraib. People were absolutely outraged and rejected all of it, just flat out, from Kansas to Oregon to Florida to New York to Texas. People were all saying the same thing. This just is unacceptable. This just can't happen. And it really forced our U.S. officials, who had been kind of hinting that the gloves are off now, it's kind of okay to almost torture people since we're the Americans and we need to be safe. Even they had to kind of back off and say, of course, torture is never legal, and those activities were un-American, and it was just those few bad apples, and we're going to take care of everything. But what we were seeing in those photographs was nothing less than naked, hooded men being hung by bars until their arms dislocated, being attacked by dogs, being raped, being slammed headfirst into walls, many of them killed, for example, in Afghanistan, drowned in vats of water, et cetera, et cetera. Some people call that torture light. As we go through our discussion, I think we would call it something else. But I was very pleased to see that the general public reaction was one of shock, outrage, and fury. After all, the prohibitions against torture, despite what people like Mr. Ashcroft and Alberto Gonzalez might have to say about it, have been absolute in this country from day one. Because so many of the colonists had fled to this country trying to get away from the rack, the screw, the star chamber, et cetera, because so many of them were refugees from torture and repression. That was built into our legal system from the days of the framing of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Patrick Henry, in fact, very early on in a national debate, pointed out that we're all here because we're trying to get away from that kind of stuff. And if we allow torture into this country, the way some congressional members are saying, the back then Congress, in order to strengthen the arm of our government, then we are, quote, lost and undone, unquote. And I think that's the exact truth. From day one, our court system has prohibited any form of abuse or torture. That means torture outright, but also what we now consider or call cruel or unusual or degrading treatment of any prisoner. If you read through the court cases, that's what the use of excessive force by a policeman is about. You're not allowed to beat a suspect just because you've managed to arrest him. You're only allowed to use that force necessary to actually carry out the arrest. Obviously, there are a lot of problems with enforcement, as we see in cases like the Rodney King case, but it is illegal. It's illegal to have prison conditions which are abusive or inhumane. It's illegal to detain people in mental hospitals under abusive or inhumane conditions. Although, ironically, it is legal to kill someone or give them the death penalty in this country, it is illegal to kill them in a cruel or unnecessarily painful way. We have to kill them kindly. And we cannot discipline prisoners in ways that are cruel or unusual within the prison system. And I think a case that's very significant to all of us, the way it places the actual prohibitions, is a prisoner who got out of line in a jail and was punished. I believe this was Texas, or suspect that it was Texas, and he was handcuffed to a hitching post for the entire day without any water and without any toilet privileges. And the United States Supreme Court reamed out the prison system for allowing any such abusive and outrageous conduct. And when you think about it, that pretty much matches some of the photographs we were seeing, probably a lot less abusive than some of the photographs we were seeing. And I'd like to know what that Supreme Court back then would have said about those photographs. I rather suspect I can imagine. It's never been permitted here. It's happened. Our police and our FBI and the CIA and our military do it off and on. We certainly remember My Lai. It has never been legal. All of the treaties that we've signed on have gone in that direction as well. The Hague Conventions were in effect in World War II, but after what we saw happened at the Bataan Death March, for example, or to people that were interrogated by the Gestapo as suspected spies or prisoners of war, the Geneva Conventions were signed. There is no exemption within the Geneva Conventions that would permit torture of any human being, and there is no exemption that permits cruel or degrading punishment of any human being whatsoever. There are several different conventions that deal with different categories of persons, but what we saw in the White House and State Department memos saying they might not technically be prisoners of war because they've carried out these crimes and because they're not wearing uniforms, therefore we can do anything we want. If they're not in the category of prisoner of war, they probably fall within Common Article 3, which would deal with anyone in an internal uprising or insurgency when there's no international warfare being carried out. For that category of persons, there can be no torture or cruel or degrading treatment. If they don't fall within those two categories, they're probably civilians, and maybe civilian saboteurs, maybe civilian bomb throwers. They can be brought to trial. They can never be tortured. They can never be cruelly treated. There is no other category. It doesn't exist. Not only that, but there are two other conventions that have followed right after the Geneva Conventions that deal with the same issues. There's the International Convention for Civil and Political Rights, which during times of war or not during times of war prohibits torture or cruel and degrading punishment, no exceptions. Then, of course, there's the Convention Against Torture, which also applies right now, no exceptions, and it includes anyone that conspires to torture a person, such as persons within the State Department, the CIA, or our military intelligence division that might say to a lower down military police person, why don't you soften them up for us? If you get someone else to do it for you, you're still guilty. The man that hires someone else to shoot his wife is guilty of murder. It doesn't matter if he says, my ulterior motive was to get the insurance money. That doesn't get you off the hook. If you hire someone to kill someone else or torture someone else, you are also guilty of that crime. And there are, in fact, two statutes now, criminal statutes within our jurisprudence, which make it a felony to conspire to torture another person, either mental or physical torture, or in any way violate or commit serious war crimes, violating serious provisions of the Geneva Conventions. If that's true, and if all our higher-up officials were in fact involved in these violations of human rights, then they are also criminally liable, which is why we hear over and over again, it didn't go any higher than just those few bad apples. Don't worry about it. They're all standing court-martial. Everything's been taken care of. It's all under investigation. go on back home. So where I do think that the public reaction matched very well what's been part of our legal system for centuries now, I think that we have, as the public, fallen into a similar trap that we've fallen into many times before, partly for lack of information, partly because things tend to drift out of the press, and partly out of naivete. I think that, once again, we've been told it was just a few bad apples and everything is under control, we shouldn't worry about it anymore. It didn't go any higher. 12 years ago, many of you will remember when news came out that my husband Everardo had in fact been tortured for 2 years, held in a full body cast, and then either dismembered or thrown out of a helicopter at the hands of CIA-paid informants in the Guatemalan military, followed immediately by more and more exposure to the case of Sister Diana Ortiz, an American nun who was severely raped and tortured in Guatemala, and had a North American come in who knew where she was being held, was on a first-name basis with the torturers, and had authority over them. They called him boss. And he took her out because there was already so much uproar from Washington and left everyone else in there to die. With our two stories, there was huge uproar on the Hill. Everybody was promising us at the Senate Intelligence Committees that we'll get to the bottom of this. It was a few bad apples. It was rogue operators. It wasn't really the CIA as an agency. It didn't go any higher. Everything's going to get better now. We're going to do investigations. We're going to declassify everything. And we're going to really get this taken care of. Well, then it drifted out of the press. It drifted out of immediate public awareness. Everybody thought the matter was being taken care of. The CIA continued to carry out torture, and people continued to die. We just saw it happen again. So when we talk to our communities about this issue, I'd like to remind everybody that the machinery, the history, the refined torture practices, they're still out there being carried out by persons who have never had to answer to a court of law. Why don't CIA officials have to answer to a court of law? Military personnel, including military intelligence people, are subject to court-martial, not the CIA because they're civilians. The FBI has to answer to the Constitution, not the CIA because the Constitution doesn't apply outside the United States where they work. The CIA is subject, if we could catch those agents, to the different felony statutes I was just referring to. They could get 20 years, and if they kill somebody, they could get life. But they sign into the register at Abu Ghraib prison, for example, as Special Agent John Doe and Special Agent John Smith on Special Agent James Bond. And the CIA can't seem to figure out who was on duty that night. They lost the records and it's gone. And if you try to file a Freedom of Information Act, you'll get what all the rest of us got. You can't have anything at all. It's all national security. And meanwhile, they're supposed to answer to Congress, to the intelligence committees, but as in my case and Diana's case and everybody else's case, they just don't give the information. So they basically blind the very congressional agency that's supposed to be supervising them and keeping them within the realms of the law. In fact, we have a section of our government run wild, and we are going to pay the consequences for that. I think there's two issues that arise again and again and again in dealing with the question of U.S. participation in torture. And one is, how deep does this actually run? How far back? How far up to the top does it actually go? Is this something that once Bush is out of office, once Gonzales is gone, once Ashcroft is gone, will things go back to where they should be? Will things become legalized again? Will the torture in the CIA be reined in? And I think, as I'll be able to show you in a few minutes, no, they won't. The CIA and the torture practices go back to the 1950s when the agency was first conceived. The stress and duress positions, the use of dogs, the psychological torture, the hanging people from their arms, the water pit, et cetera, those have been around for decades. The most famous photograph of Abu Ghraib, of the hooded man with the electrodes hanging from his genitals and his fingers, all intelligence specialists recognize that photograph immediately. That position is called the Vietnam, for good reason. It was developed in Vietnam. And most of the things that we saw happen to the prisoners over there have happened in Central America, have happened in Latin America, and can be tracked all the way back to Operation Phoenix exercises over in Vietnam for so many decades ago. So not only do we have an incredible, in-depth, systematic, across-the-board problem, But we keep being told by our national administrators and officials today that things are different now. No one's doing torture, of course, but if we did, it might be legal, or at least it should be legal, because after September 11th, everything changed. There could be a ticking bomb. What if there was a nuclear bomb under Grand Central Station and it was about to go off and we captured the one suspect in the entire world that could tell us where it was? Wouldn't we be allowed to torture that person and save the world? And in fact, we heard variations of that hypothetical over and over and over again on the radio. There was a reenactment of it on Fox News at one point. And what most of those programs don't say is that that's never happened. For a number of reasons, it's never happened. And for a number of reasons that we'll discuss later, torturing the person probably would not save the world. And our legal system already has the flexibility to deal with that were it ever to arise. So first, I'd like to talk about exactly how far back does our involvement in torture go? Who came up with those practices that we saw in the photographs? Did those MPs just come up with that idea? Did we just put some sort of naturally psychopathic people in charge of these prisoners and tell them to soften them up? Or is this much more refined? And are these practices that were worked through and developed over many decades up to the very top of the CIA and authorized and put in handbooks, et cetera, et cetera? I'd like to start with those two questions. And then I'd like to deal with the national security question of, is there a reason why maybe we should allow torture under extreme circumstances? Because we're being bombarded with our own fears out of September 11th, out of those photographs of the burning towers, just sort of bludgeon us into yielding permission to carry out torture, something that's never been allowed. And I think we all have to be ready to deal with that fear factor in our own lives and also in talking to our friends and our neighbors and our communities when we work on these political issues. In dealing with how deeply involved is the CIA and has the CIA been all these different decades in the practice of torture, we have to look at what the CIA has always said from the beginning, which is, look, we in the military, the Defense Department, we give money to the armies that we think we should fund and stuff, and we give training because we want to professionalize them. And we buy information from different intelligence officials, and some of them are unsavory, but we have no idea at the time we're handing over money that they're actually torturing anyone. There's just no connection whatsoever. And I'd like to deal with that question first, out of Central America, Latin America, and going back to Vietnam, and then describing some of the similarities between the torture practices used. Most of you know quite a lot from over the years about Everardo's case, but just to summarize, he was captured alive by the Guatemalan military on March the 12th, 1992. They told us that he had committed suicide in combat and was buried in a certain grave in Retoluleo. And we found out later that, in fact, he'd been captured alive and that they'd dragged an 18-year-old soldier out of the local barracks, beaten him to death, placed him in the grave, and then sent me a description of my husband and not the 18-year-old so that I would never go looking for him. Because Everardo was so high level and because he knew so much about the URNG plans and history and battle strategies, et cetera, as a commanding officer, they subjected him to a new torture technique whereby the goal was to torture him very long term, perhaps years even, with the help of a physician to keep him alive through those torture sessions so that he would break and eventually share his intelligence with them. We know that he was taken alive. He was not seriously wounded. He was severely battered for a long time and also drugged by military physicians. He was seen at one point strapped to a bed with an unidentified gas cylinder, like an oxygen cylinder, next to that bed, with Colonel Alpérez bending over him, taking notes, and a physician standing in the doorway. And whatever toxic substance was in that cylinder, he was grotesquely swollen, stripped down, and one arm and leg were apparently had hemorrhaged because they were bandaged up very tightly, and he was raving. We know that he survived. He was seen a few days later looking very ill. That was June of 1992. By then, of course, I had opened the grave and was carrying out my 3 different hunger strikes, while State Department people said over and over and over again they had no information about him at all, and while the CIA was telling everyone in the intelligence committees that they had no information at all. And at the end of 1995, Senator Torricelli did come forward and tell us that he had been killed already, that the State Department and the CIA certainly did have information, because the person that had him killed, Alpirez, was in fact a CIA-paid informant. And as more and more files started coming out, we learned that Everardo had tried so many times to escape and come so close to escaping that they placed him in a full body cast. As they continued to batter him for information, he apparently said, "Sure, I'll take you up to the clandestine radio station," and led them into an ambush. And that at some point they realized he wasn't giving any information. He was leading them on one wild goose chase after another, and they had him killed, either the helicopter route or the dismemberment route. I don't know which. We also know that many people in the high-level group of intelligence officials who carried out his torture and plotted to keep his situation top secret were also paid CIA informants, a number of them. We also know that the CIA informed the State Department 6 days after he was picked up that he was alive and that the Intelligence Division was planning to torture him better for his information and would therefore keep his death secret. We all found that out 3 years later. A few months after that, they got another bulletin saying, "We talked to 3 top-level military officials. They confirmed that he's still alive. Everardo is still alive, and so are 350 other secretly detained POWs." Meanwhile, the State Department letter and the Intelligence Committee, myself, the OAS, the United Nations, were still getting the same message that no information about him existed. For the next 2.5 years, bulletin after bulletin came into both groups saying his friends are being thrown down wells, they're being kept in water pits so deep they're nearly drowning in Ratululeo, they're being thrown out of helicopters, they're being massacred, he's being tortured, et cetera, et cetera. And just before the 60 Minutes bulletin with Mike Wallace, they start saying, "I guess they're all dead. We haven't seen any of them for a very long time." So by the time Senator Torricelli came out with the information, it was just too late to save any of the 350. Alpirez, by the way, also went twice to the School of the Americas, is on the DEA corrupt officer list, and received $44,000 from the CIA the same month he was torturing Everardo personally with the gas cylinder at his side. After all of that uproar, people suddenly, for the first time in nearly a decade, turned around and looked at Sister Diana Ortiz, who had been telling everyone this for a decade and had been having it said by the State Department over and over that she must be mad, and it never happened. Then they started remembering the 112 cigarette burns on her back, the extraordinary torture that she went through, the wrapping of her hand around a machete and stabbing the woman prisoner sitting next to her, and the American who drove her out of there, who had authority over these people, who knew where the torture cell was, who could talk to these people on a first-name basis, who could tell them to stop torturing someone, who could have saved all those lives. And when she went back to the embassy the next day and said, "Send your friend back, save all the other people," she was literally blacklisted and slandered for 10 years as a maniac who didn't know what had happened to herself, or maybe had backed into a strange grill, or put the burns on her own back, or they didn't seem to line up perfectly with her T-shirt, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Suddenly everyone looked at her and it was like, oh. And people really began to talk to her and interview her and realized, of course she knows exactly what's happening. And several years later, although the CIA has insisted from day one that a certain agent who would have been the logical person to have been sent to pick her up, the person that was the big guy on the ground down there, that he hadn't even been in the country. But a photograph of him was received through a channel I won't name. And if you were to put a curly, dark-haired wig on this tall, like North American-looking guy with a very North European face, if you were to put sunglasses and a curly, dark wig on him, it matches. Very unusual bone structure, very long jaw, long, narrow nose, very, very unmistakable face. After that, I started being a little annoyed that the government wouldn't really answer Diana Ortiz, wouldn't follow up on the CIA issues, wouldn't follow up on torture issues at all. So I started investigating just a little bit more. I wondered how many other people had North Americans in the torture cell. And at that point, I got a prisoner of war out who had seen Everardo and who had been electrocuted, drowned, suffocated, had a hood put over his head with insecticides in it until he would literally pass out and they'd have to give him CPR, et cetera, et cetera. And he, at one point, was tied to a chair when a North American came in and stood behind him, speaking from a very tall point with a heavy gringo accent, and asked him over and over again about Cuba. All he wanted to know was, you know, did the guns come from Cuba? What do you know about Cuba? Did you train in Cuba? I figured the guy myself must have been, for sure, Canadian. They're very obsessed with Cuba. Must have been. But again, the man spoke with authority, which is very, very striking. We certainly have, in fact, we have 2 people sitting here today who were severely tortured in Central America, with North Americans actually supervising. We have a very close friend of mine here who was given very severe electrical shocks back in the 60s, with a North American explaining where to put the wires and how to use them, et cetera, et cetera. And that's very interesting, because that's at exactly the same time period that there were so many complaints about Dan Mitrione bringing highly specialized electrical shock torture sessions to both Uruguay and Brazil. There was also another woman who's sitting in the audience today too, and I'll introduce these people in a little bit because I think we should give them quite a hand for their courage. She was hideously tortured in El Salvador. She was impaled through the rectum, lost enormous amounts of blood, she was raped, she was jumped up and down until she had a number of bones broken, she was burned, she was gashed, and she lived, and she talked. But who was in her torture room? She was blindfolded. There were many Salvadorans in there giving her this torture, but there was a North American saying, all right, who's next? You know, you did that technique, who's next? Who's going to use a different technique? What are you going to do? Who's going to make her talk? And who at the end of the session said, she's dead, get rid of her. He just let it happen. We know of another case where it in fact has been confirmed by the CIA that one of their own agents was in fact present. It was a daughter of a high-level Honduran military official, a young lawyer named Inez, who was abducted off the streets by Battalion 316. She was drowned repeatedly. She was hung by her arms until her arms dislocated. She was terrorized by dogs, as was Sister Diana Ortiz. She was not allowed to sleep. She'd have cold water dashed into her face every 10 minutes, like clockwork, for months, for weeks on end. She wasn't given food off and on. The number of tortures that were applied to her were extraordinary. And she's always said there was a North American there because I could hear a pen rattling next to the guy that was actually asking me the questions, whom I knew very well. And the person that was writing would hand the paper over to my torturer, and the torturer would then read it complete with all the Spanish grammatical mistakes and errors of words and stuff. He'd just read it literally. And in the CIA files, in a secret testimony to the Senate, which was later declassified, the CIA says, well, you know, one of our guys was there. Yes, he was there sometimes, but he insisted that she be better treated, and he never actually saw any torture. Florencio Caballero, one of her torturers, who later fled to Canada and told everything about Battalion 316, said, well, of course he saw the tortures. You know, her arms were black and blue. There were scratch marks all over the place. She was lying unconscious next to a tub of water at one point. They knew all of that. And what's very interesting is the building where she was being held in Dumu was a secret prison where many people were being tortured by Battalion 316. The courts couldn't get in, the police couldn't get in, the families couldn't get in. It was a secret detention center. But the CIA could get in. And if we look at the other cases, the similarities go on and on. We were very directly involved. There's the case of a young physician in El Salvador named Juan, who was picked up because he was doing medical work for the poor when a battle came through the area and the army decided he must be a guerrilla. And he remembers being strapped down to the floor, badly wounded, and they hadn't given him any medical care. And again, he was blindfolded, and they dug through his arm wound at one point in front of a North American who was speaking in an accent he recognized. He knew lots of North Americans from San Salvador. And they pulled a maggot out and put it on his chest, and the North American was saying, well, ask him this and ask him that, and have him get on the phone and talk to his uncle and get him to incriminate himself. And at one point they said, you have to eat the maggot we just put on your chest. And he tried to get his head up that far because they were kicking him in the back of the neck, but he couldn't reach. And all he can really remember is the North American laughing and laughing and laughing. He also suffered a second session with the North American present, which is a very good example of what we euphemistically call stress and duress. He was hung from his arms, very tightly cuffed, and they were turning black. His feet couldn't quite touch the ground. He's substantially shorter than I am. And there was a stake impaled into his rectum, so if he did try to get his feet onto the ground, he would be impaled worse. And the North American was there watching that. There was a 14-year-old in Guatemala named Marvin who had been very badly beaten and picked up with all his other 14-year-old friends, and who was dragged, not blindfolded, in front of a North American back in the early 80s. The man apparently felt that he had nothing that he needed to hide from and openly interrogated all of the kids for hours on end and was very specialized in interrogation techniques. And at one point, when Marvin was trying not to turn in anyone else, he didn't want his sisters raped, one just had been, the man said, "Who do you think you're kidding? You know, I've been doing interrogation work for years. I was in Africa, I was in Vietnam." Once again, I'm sure the man was Canadian. If you go back historically to Uruguay and Brazil, we see all the same torture tactics, and we see North Americans in the torture cells because as the interrogation was going on between the torture victim and the interrogator, someone was translating into English, every question, every answer. And if you go back yet a step farther, you get into Vietnam with all the same torture techniques, many of them embodied in the Kubark Manual, which later ended up at the School of the Americas. And a very high number of people who were in Vietnam with Operation Phoenix, with the CIA, ended up as interrogation and intelligence specialists in Latin America, especially Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador during the civil wars there. If we look at the techniques used, they're exactly what we just got through seeing, some of them in the photographs, some of them in witness testimonies out of Iraq and Afghanistan. Both Diana Ortiz and Inez Murillo were terrorized by dogs. Diana will not sit next to a dog to this day. Inez was held with her arms in what's called the Scorpio position. They tie your wrists to your ankles and then suspend you from the ceiling, and that's when her arm joints popped out and they've never healed. She was left there not for an hour at a time, but for days at a time. Diana also remembers cameras. Many of us thought, you know, those stupid MPs, what were they doing taking pictures? Didn't they know they'd get caught? That's in fact part of the psychological torture. They're photographed in these horrible, horrible positions, you know, often during rape, often naked, often in other things that are just appalling to them. And they're told, if you ever try to talk, or if you ever try to do anything, or if you don't do what we tell you to do, we're going to send these movies or these photographs to your family, or we're going to post them all over your village or whatever. So you can imagine what that did to a lot of the fundamental Muslim men who were prisoners at Abu Ghraib, who were forced into sexual acts with each other, to imagine that those photographs could appear in the hands of family and friends. The drowning sessions called waterboarding happened to Sheikh Mohammed, who was captured in Pakistan early on in the war. And the way that's always explained to us by our press corps is that the person is submerged in water until he thinks he is going to drown, as if, oh, scaredy cat, he just gets nervous, right? And doesn't do any harm. Actually, the way any Central American can tell you that that works is you're submerged until you start drowning and lose consciousness and have to be revived through CPR. And once revived, then you're drowned again. The same with the hood with the pesticide in it. The idea is to put you through convulsions in the beginning death throes and then get you back. There's also, in several of the White House memos going back and forth, there was mention that the CIA had been given permission to do especially harsh torture tactics, for example, in Afghanistan. And they've admitted that the CIA asked for permission to do something called the water pit, and they won't admit whether or not permission was given or not. They don't want to discuss it further. The water pit is a pit of water that a prisoner is placed in, and so deep that he has to hang onto bars overhead or keep swimming indefinitely, or else they'll drown, so that if you fall asleep, you're likely to drown. And the person is kept there very, very long term. Well, that was done, that's in my CIA files. It was done at the Retoluleo military base in Guatemala for years. That's where Everardo was held. It's in my CIA files. All of these things we've seen over and over and over again. There's a set of sketches, in fact, I'm not sure if they're here or not, but that show hooded men with ropes around their neck or hanging from bars overhead by their arms backwards, being bitten by ants, having water thrown into their faces, being raped, being kicked, being slammed into walls. They look like sketches of the photographs we saw from Iraq and Afghanistan and Guantanamo. But actually they're dated 1986. They're from the testimonies of prisoners at Mariona in El Salvador. Herbert Anaya was a very famous human rights leader who ran the Human Rights Commission there, and when half of his commission was arrested in the middle of the night and thrown into Mariona, He had them all interview everybody that was in the prison about the tortures they'd gone through. One of them, of course, had been tortured by a North American. Others had been tortured by Salvadorans. But the sketches are indistinguishable. You can't tell them from the different photographs and sketches that we've seen recently from the Middle East. Herbert, by the way, was killed a year later. He was shot through the head. He had been tortured not long after those sketches and testimonies came out of Mariona. And he was subjected also to what sounds like not such a bad thing, an uncomfortable position, a little stress and duress. He was simply made to stand, nothing else, for 3 days and 3 nights with no break whatsoever. And when his lawyer came to see him, he couldn't put his shoes on. His feet were so swollen, and they had to cover his lap up with a cloth so that the lawyer wouldn't see his feet. And the reason is that if you're forced to stand that long, just standing upright that long, your lymph system cannot work properly, and enormous swelling sets in. So does ureic poisoning. You're starting to overtax your kidneys, and you start suffering from ureic poisoning. It's a very, very serious torture form. A very similar documentation of people that were subjected to the stressful positions with the British and their certain IRA prisoners in the 70s when, quote, all they did was hood them and have them stand up against a wall spread eagle with most of the weight on their arms, and with very loud noises irregularly playing in the background. I think after a week, one of them couldn't say his name. One of them couldn't count to 10. They'd all had nervous breakdowns. None of them could use their hands to pick up a fork or write their names with a pen. Most of them died very young. They suffered severe psychological trauma for a very long time. So these are all a common notebook that we and our allies have been using for a very, very long time. It is torture. It's supposed to not look like torture. It's supposed to look like discomfort. It's supposed to keep the American public satisfied that we really aren't doing torture. We're just getting information by being a little bit tough, not very tough. But it's torture in the end, and there's no one that's ever gone through any of those positions or had their family members picked up or had their children picked up, as has also happened in Afghanistan and Iraq recently. They can tell you it was anything but torture and that they've never fully recovered. So we get to the last issue here, and I'm panicking looking at my watch, which is that our government keeps telling us, well, no one likes torture, but we have to do it. What if there was an atom bomb placed under Grand Central Station in New York City? And to begin with, torture doesn't work. You can torture that person. You can torture any person, and they're going to say everything but the kitchen sink. They're going to say yes to everything. Sister Diana was shown a photograph of a Guatemalan woman who didn't look anything like her. And they were burning her back. And they said, is that you? And she said, no, that woman's a lot shorter and has much curlier hair and different features. And they burned her back again and said, is that you? And she said, oh yeah, that's me. And they burned her back again. You don't get any specific information. You get everything in a waterfall from most people. Some people never talk at all, of course. If someone high level enough to know where a nuclear weapon is under Grand Central Station, someone that high level has been very carefully trained according to any clandestine security rules, which are pretty much the same depending on any, from army to army, from clandestine group to clandestine group. Those people are very carefully trained, just the way our own army is, to withstand at least 24 hours of torture. They're trained either not to say anything at all for 24 hours, or if they're going to say something, they have memorized harmless information that they can rattle off in between. That's just how it works. And again, all of our own soldiers are trained in exactly that way. So if you do catch someone an hour before the bomb's going to go off, you really aren't going to get that information with an hour of torture. You can shoot the man's child like they threatened to do on Fox News in that reenactment, but you're probably not going to get the information you want. Even if the man starts talking, his colleagues will have been watching him every 20 minutes or every 10 minutes at that stage of the game, and the bomb's going to have been moved anyway, even if the man does start talking. Maybe most importantly, our legal system already provides for exactly this situation. Suppose somehow this really did happen, a CIA person committed torture and saved 100,000 lives, or 1 million lives, or whatever. If that really happened, I don't think the prosecutor is going to decide to prosecute. I don't think that's going to happen. If he does, I don't think the judge and the jury are going to give much of a sentence. I don't think this person's going to go to prison for saving the world. If there's mandatory sentencing, that's what presidential clemency and pardons are for. This person's not going to serve a day. Our legal system has all of this in place. It has the flexibility it needs. So all that's going to happen is we're going to start sliding down that slippery slope towards disaster. If we tell everybody, okay, if there's going to be a bomb in an hour, it's okay to torture, well, what about an hour and a half? What about 3 hours? What about a day? What about next week? You can only do it if you know that bomb's going to go off. Well, what if it might go off? You can only torture the suspect if you have absolute proof that he's the one. Well, what if you're pretty sure and that bomb's going to go off? Or what if it's a neighbor who might have some important information? Or what if the kid might have overheard something? It just all goes to hell, which is what we just saw happen in Afghanistan and Iraq. The CIA has always done these harsh practices. They got permission to do even worse things in Afghanistan, where they were working closely with military intelligence. They both came over to Iraq and were working in Abu Ghraib, where the young uniformed soldiers saw what they were doing and learned quite a few good tricks. It corrupts us. It corrupts our entire system, absolutely. There's no breaking it. There's no slowing it down once the genie's out of the bottle. You can't put it back in. We really have a lot to learn from Israel in this regard. That country, of course, deals with some kind of bomb about to go off literally every few minutes. The possibility arises. Originally, the Israeli Supreme Court with the Landau Commission said moderate force by the Israeli security forces was acceptable. Then B'Tselem, back in the late 90s, came out with a very careful study and documentation showing that 85% of all Palestinian detainees were being tortured. And the Israeli Supreme Court came out and said, well, now it's illegal. Now moderate force is illegal. And obviously, there's a very serious enforcement problem in Israel because people are still being tortured fairly massively. But at least the court had the sense to say, this can't be contained. It doesn't work. We are not going to legalize it. It's over. And there were a number of references, of course, to Holocaust history made in that discussion. Then I think the very, very last issue, though, is does this, in the end, make us any safer, allowing torture or torture light or torture soft or cruel and degrading punishment or humiliation? Does violence beget violence, or does the tough guy approach and shock and awe make us a lot safer? And I'm always sort of intrigued. I've never seen a situation where shock, awe, and brutality somehow create world peace. I mean, I'm still waiting for a good example that would support that theory, but I haven't heard one yet. But if we look at the reverse, what does the tough guy, quote unquote, using torture, what has that got in any other country under similar circumstances? Classic example historically is Algeria, where the French colonists were dealing with the FLN and constant bombings, and they responded with this just vicious counterattack of torture of prisoners across the board. And the result temporarily is that the bombing stopped, but the long-term result was that all of the Algerians banded together in outrage and threw the French out, and in fact many in France banded together against the French military as well. But they lost Algeria. Vietnam, we had Operation Phoenix, and torture was pretty routine. I don't think we won there. Doesn't seem to me like Northern Ireland has become exactly a peaceful zone. South Africa, Mandela did become president. Apartheid didn't last. That was just about the most brutal kind of crackdown and repressive methods you could have used. And of course, Israel. And I was very, very curious, and I'll end with this study, which is incomplete, but I think it's very telling for all of us in that we could learn a lot from them. I was very curious and tried to find where in the different profiles of suicide bombers the issue of trauma came in. I wondered how many suicide bombers had had a father killed or a bone broken by the security forces when they threw a rock as a child in the first Intifada. Just curious, one of many factors. Is that a factor? And on everything I could find, they would tell me the age, the level of religion, where they grew up, how many kids, how many brothers and sisters, parents alive or dead, those kinds of traditional issues that you read over and over again as factors in Time magazine and stuff. Not one would tell me about trauma, which I rather suspect the Mossad and the CIA have thought of, but it's not anywhere in materials that we can get. It's not accessible to us. So I went over there last summer and had to hire several Palestinians, since none of them can travel anywhere, they're all under travel restrictions, to just help me get some basic statistics together. And in the first Intifada, depending on how you define a suicide bomber, the number was between 30 and 50. Second Intifada, it's 150 and counting. When I broke all of it down, where were the clusters, the great big clusters of almost all the mortars? Jenin, Gaza, Ramallah, Bethlehem, Tulkarem, all of the places where there have been the worst crackdown by the security forces, the response has been a huge increase or surge in the suicide bombers. Of the 17 out of Jenin, I have answers for 14, and they were all severely traumatized. Someone shot in front of their house, a father in jail for 20 years, 4 friends killed, along that level of trauma. And I just got the same set of answers pretty much for the region of Ramallah, and I'm still waiting for the rest. So if we use all of this, maybe we'll prevent an ambush down the road tomorrow. But the response to the Abu Ghraib photographs, of course, was that Nicholas Berg was decapitated a few days later, specifically because of what had been seen through the press. And also the bombings against US troops has gone up to nearly 50 a day. Some days 30, some days 50, but in that range. So if we use these techniques, we're not going to be safer. That's just myth. We're going to have to figure out other ways as human society to develop and evolve and learn to prevent conflicts from the outset. And not surprisingly, Dr. Martin Luther King has said it much better than I can. He said, we have to learn to live together like brothers or die together like fools. And I think that says it all. And before I finish, I just would like to ask Mario and Maria to stand. They were 2 of the survivors of torture at the hands of North Americans that I mentioned, and are 2 of my big heroes. And for those of you who would like to do something today, or it would probably have to wait till Monday, there are pamphlets out front. The House was trying to sneak through some extremely bad provisions into the implementation bill for that were recommended by the 9/11 panel. And they're anti-immigrant bills, but there's a risk of torture very implicit in several of the clauses. The Senate at the conference has been blocking these, but you need to raise your voices very, very loudly now during the lame duck session coming up. Basically, one of the things was someone could be deported to a country where they'd be tortured as long as there were diplomatic assurances that they wouldn't be tortured. We did that with Maher Arar. He lived in Canada since he was 17, was a Canadian citizen with a business and a family over there, and he was sent back to Syria with diplomatic assurances on our request for interrogation and was tortured for a year. The other is that even habeas corpus for certain deportees might be suspended so that only Homeland Security could make rulings on their cases. Habeas corpus hasn't been lifted since the Civil War. So if you could make calls on that, right now every one of our elected leaders is scared because of what happened at the elections. They need to hear from you. And if anyone's got time to make a call for Mordecai and Vanunu and say that for a man about 5 feet tall who's 50 years old has spent 12 years in solitary in a 6-foot by 4-foot cell, and then 6 more years in intensive security care, doesn't need to be dragged out of a church sanctuary, the St. George Cathedral guest house in West Jerusalem, by 30 heavily armed guards on motorcycles, which is what happened on Wednesday. It's just psychological torture. There's serious questions as to whether his initial kidnapping from Rome had maybe a little bit of CIA involvement there. So if people have time to just protest to the Israeli embassy, he has to go answer anything the police want this week without his attorney. So they're waiting to see what we're going to do. So thank you.